So today I want to talk about climate change, what the consequences of climate change will be, who is responsible for this crisis, and whether politicians, technology, our governments, environmentalists are ever going to be able to save us, and what we need to do in order to prevent apocalypse. First, I think it's really important to say that there's no actual scientific controversy about global warming. 97% of climate scientists agree that human-caused global warming is real. Even oil companies like ExxonMobil agree that climate change is real. Any evidence that climate change is not happening is largely fueled by misinformation campaigns by fossil fuel companies spending vast amounts of money to manufacture uncertainty about climate change. So what will the impacts of climate change be? Scientists have confirmed that if we stick to current rates of warming, we could see between 4 to 5 degrees of warming by 2100. And whilst this probably doesn't sound like a lot, empirical assessments made by scientists lays out what 4 to 5 degrees of warming would mean. In the words of Revolutionary Left Radio,
at 4 degrees of warming, there would be 8 million more annual cases of dengue fever in Latin America alone, and there would be a global food crisis on an annual basis the world over. Floods would occur much more often and grow radically more intense, multiplying 30-fold in Bangladesh and as much as 60-fold in the United Kingdom. Climate disasters like droughts, heat waves, hurricanes, the spread of disease, floods, and more could pile up in the same country in the same year, devastating entire nations as they scramble to address disasters in every corner of their territory. Globally, damages from these disasters are likely to reach $600 trillion, which is more than twice all the wealth that currently exists in the world today. Couple that with the annihilation of economic growth and global GDP, and we will have a poorer world with increasingly costly disasters happening more and more frequently. All of this is what we will get by 2100, the UN predicts, if we continue business as usual. And remember, even if you aren't planning on living until 2100, you will still be affected by all of this. These things will grow and grow year by year. Nobody under the age of 60 years old today, assuming they live anywhere close to the average lifespan of a human being, will be able to avoid some degree of these effects. This is not posterity's problem. This is our problem. And our single lifespans are the scales we are operating on.
Researchers have predicted that for every degree of warming, society will see between a 10 and 20% increase in the likelihood of armed conflict. The instability of food shortages, habitat destruction, and misery that comes from climate change will undoubtedly lead to more war, as well as regional and interpersonal conflict. The World Bank has estimated that by 2050, 140 million refugees will be moving across the globe, displaced by various effects of climate change. And the UN projects there to be over 200 million refugees by 2050. As we have seen with our current refugee crises, the influx of refugees is likely to result in increased nationalism, chauvinism, and violence. All these conditions are a perfect breeding ground for fascism to thrive. In fact, eco-fascism is already on the rise today, as climate change is a perfect weapon for fascists to use, as it will induce genocide on an unprecedented scale. We are already showing a brutality in the face of climate change that amasses to a form of genocide, allowing people and cultures to die without taking any meaningful action. The injustice of it is also inescapable. The poorest people in the world and the babies not yet born, who have contributed the least to this mess, are those that will bear the brunt of its effects. We aren't just talking about inequality, we are talking about a world system in which 2/3 of humanity will not have the ecological space for survival, with no land, water, or biodiversity within the next few decades. As Mike Davis aptly puts it, the Earth's first-class passengers will be able to wall themselves off from the rest of humanity in a green and gated oasis of permanent affluence on an otherwise stricken planet. That being said, if you think you're safe because you live in a rich country, you're also wrong. Nobody on any corner of the globe is safe. The US is one of the top countries predicted to be hit hardest by 2 degrees of warming, let alone 4 to 5 degrees. And this is just a small glimpse of what climate change will look like at current rates of warming. If we get to 6 degrees of warming, there will be little hope for civilization as we know it. And we have just 11 years to prevent rates of warming before climate change becomes irreversible and uncontrollable. But what is causing this crisis in the first place? Part 1. Capitalism and climate change. More and more research supports the idea that we need radical systemic change in our economic system if we are to have any hope of preventing climate change catastrophe. Even if you think that calling for systemic change is just a radical idea that will never happen, it's important to recognize that it's not just radicals and activists that are calling for this. A landmark report from the United Nations Scientific Panel on Climate Change says that avoiding catastrophic climate change requires transforming the world economy at a speed and scale that has no documented historical precedent within a few years. Scientists at the Tyndall Centre have been saying for over a decade that getting to the emissions reduction levels that we need to get to in the developed world is not compatible with economic growth. And researchers for the UN Sustainable Development Report have agreed dominant economic theories and conceptions of modern capitalism are incompatible with the continued existence of humanity, and call for societies to start thinking about new models of governance and economics. So why is it impossible to prevent climate change catastrophe within our capitalist economic system? Capitalism is an economic system where the maximization of private profit lies at its core. If the money invested in a firm does not return a profit, its creditors and shareholders cannot be paid, and the firm will cease to operate. In this case, the firm will either be declared bankrupt or it will be taken over by another company. So in order to avoid being taken over by competition and remain stable under capitalism, companies have to keep producing more and more in order to maintain economic growth and accumulate profit. So capitalism is based off of the endless pursuit of profit, which requires endless growth. Endless growth is inherently unsustainable because it requires the continuous extraction of raw materials, turning them into commodities and distributing them around the globe. This usually relies on fossil fuel energy, the mass disposal of waste, and even engaging in conflicts or wars to gain access to natural resources, markets, or cheap labour, contributing to climate change on a large scale. There can't be infinite growth on a finite planet with finite resources. At some point, capitalism will collapse because there simply won't be any more resources to extract in order to produce goods. There's no consideration for the long-term well-being of people or the planet because profits are organized around short-term horizons, even if it means causing irreparable damage to the world's ecosystem. Competition forces even the most environmentally conscious and socially responsible capitalist to be inherently unsustainable, because if they don't, other firms will. Since their competitors cut costs to be able to reinvest in the firm's growth and thereby become more competitive, if one firm refrains from doing so, it will soon be pushed out of the market by others. As a result, firms are forced to choose the cheapest possible option, which generally means the most environmentally detrimental one. Because the goal is profit, there is little interest in social good, and so they do not take into account the planet they are destroying in order to make a profit and grow their market share. Even if there are environmental regulations attempting to prevent environmental harm, because capitalism has become increasingly global, corporations can simply move companies to a different country to avoid regulation. As a result, governments often stop implementing environmental regulations because they fear that if they do, corporations will simply move to a different country where there are more favorable conditions for doing business. And capitalists can use things like the threat to reduce employment, investment, or the ability to earn foreign exchange as powerful tools in battles for environmental concerns. Even worse than this, many trade agreements allow foreign investors to sue governments if they put into place any regulations that can be perceived to interfere with their actual or prospective profit. Even the threat of a costly lawsuit can deter governments from implementing environmental regulation to prevent environmental destruction. So as we have seen, the destruction of the planet and soaring greenhouse gas emissions is a fundamental part of the capitalist system. So any solutions presented within our system is never going to be enough. No matter how many new green technologies or products they develop, or new environmental NGOs and charities pop up, or market solutions they come up with, they are developing these solutions within a system based off of the relentless exploitation of the natural world. So unless we confront, transcend, and revolutionize our economic system, climate change can become a runaway train and we will face apocalypse. So what are we going to do about all of this? Given all this information, a lot of people are looking to governments, politicians, technology, billionaires, environmentalists, corporations to solve the problem. I want to look into the solutions offered up by each of these categories and see if there's any meaningful way in which these groups are going to be able to save us from ecological collapse. Part 2. Can environmental groups save us? There are, of course, many non-governmental NGOs and charities that are doing amazing work that creates meaningful change. However, the vast majority position themselves as working within the economic system rather than challenging it. They see the problem as something that can be solved through managerial or technical solutions within the current structures of governance. Today, partnerships between environmental NGOs and big brand companies have become increasingly common, with ties deepening between NGOs and the world's biggest oil and gas companies. The Nature Conservancy has accepted millions of dollars from British Petroleum and is currently working with them. The Environmental Defence Fund led the way in 1990, partnering with McDonald's to introduce more sustainable packaging. Today, the WWF receives funding from and works with Coca-Cola to save polar bears. Even Greenpeace, one of the most traditionally anti-corporate NGOs, is now cooperating with Unilever and Coca-Cola. Even in cases where these partnerships don't take place, most NGOs and charities in general are financed by Western-dominated economic organizations like the World Bank, Western governments, corporations, or the UN. In doing this, they are accepting corporations as allies rather than pursuing the kind of disruptive radical change needed to prevent climate change. They are inextricably bound up with the economic system that we actually need to challenge if we have any hope of averting climate change. Because they have to cater to the wishes of the people funding them and want to continue receiving money from these organizations, they're very likely to end up having to adopt policies, strategies, and goals that are incompatible with creating the level of change needed to avert climate change. Paul Kivell's research on social services finds that NGOs and charities are forced to compete with one another for funding. Through this, they can often begin focusing on remaining a business, and actually doing the environmental work becomes a secondary focus. Having to cater to the wishes of these organizations often means that they have to give up intersectional politics and solidarity with other groups. For example, environmental NGOs have been forced to disengage with and undermine Indigenous resistance to keep funders happy, even though Indigenous struggles for land and life challenges the framework upon which our colonial and capitalist society is based. By being forced to disengage with such movements, they are weakening fundamentally transformative parts of the environmental movement. In order to ensure that their funding isn't jeopardized, they often have to present their work in a framework that is shorn of any historical or political context. The amount of bureaucracy involved in keeping funders happy, such as writing grant proposals and wooing foundations, also robs NGO workers of time and energy that would otherwise be spent on more radical causes. These organizations de-radicalize and remove key figures from social justice movements by employing and absorbing the most passionate and effective activists that would otherwise be challenging the status quo and creating meaningful change. These organizations also take care of people and keep hope alive amongst those suffering. Through this, they can prevent people from organizing and revolting. I'm definitely not advocating for an accelerationist standpoint, making conditions worse for people, and I'm not saying that all of these environmental NGOs are bad, but I think it's really important to understand the NGO phenomenon within the broader political context in which it takes place. As Maddie Waters puts it, the state and ruling classes instrumentalize NGOs to monitor, co-opt and control social justice movements and manage dissent. NGO work makes a small contribution to social justice, but within strict parameters. In this way, NGOs can often serve to prevent the kind of radical systemic change needed to prevent crisis. At the same time, they give the general public the impression that they have the environmental crisis under control, when in reality, the only changes they are making is in a materially inconsequential way. In this way, they can diffuse political anger and blunt the edges of political resistance. Part 3. Can corporations save us? Aside from corporations that outright reject environmental concern and climate change, there are two main approaches taken by corporations to address climate change. First, the accommodation of environmental concerns within their practices. In most cases, however, this is a form of greenwashing, where companies present themselves as being environmentally responsible when at the same time they engage in highly damaging practices. In this way, they are using climate change concern to make more profit. The second way is through providing environmental choices known as sustainable or green business. This has become incredibly popular over the past few decades, with companies promoting a wide range of ethical and green products. Through this, many people internalize the idea that changing consumer choices and practices will mitigate climate change. It is a practice embraced by a sizable proportion of the population in affluent or developed societies, and the focus on consumer choices has also become a widely accepted policy goal for governments. It's very convenient for corporations and governments to further this idea, because the more we focus on individual responsibility, the less we challenge the state and government to implement meaningful changes to address this crisis. Yet the idea that this human existential problem can be solved by tweaking our consumption habits is dangerous. We are taught to reduce our use of plastic to stop the ocean plastic pollution problem, when fishing nets from big fishing industries makes up 46% of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and much of the rest consists of other forms of fishing gear. We are taught to consume less and preserve more water, whilst big agricultural industries are responsible for consuming over 90% of the world's water. Of course, we should try and minimize our impacts if we're able to, but the problems we face are structural and aren't going to be solved by us taking responsibility over what we consume. In fact, research has found that people who identify as conscious consumers use more energy and carbon than those who do not. The truth is that just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions, and we have about 3 billion people on Earth who contribute nothing to global warming, people whose greenhouse gas emissions are essentially zero, and we have another 2.5 billion or more whose emissions are very slight. This isn't a problem of our individual consumerism, and this sense leads to apathy and denialism. And whilst we are preoccupied purchasing our menstrual cups and reusable razors, we let corporations, the government, and our economic system off the hook completely. It would be false to place the blame entirely on corporations. Even if these 100 companies were to disappear, another 100 would emerge to take their place. This is how capitalism works. The truth is that production is contingent on consumption. Demand is created not by consumers, but by producers that use a host of techniques to manipulate public tastes. Without sufficient consumption, the production cycle would be paralyzed. The focus on individuals as the problem also leads governments and corporations and some environmental groups to further the idea that climate change is caused by the fact that there are too many people on the planet. This idea leads to neo-colonial practices of population control in the global south and strengthens the justification used for attacking migrants and the poor. The truth is that population growth cannot be examined apart from the economic system in which it is embedded. Under a capitalist system, more people means more workers, which means greater competition for jobs, which ultimately means lower wages and new markets to sell its goods. Population growth is a strategic response to the conditions of capital accumulation. Whatever way we look at it, it's clear that corporations are not going to be able to save us from apocalypse. Part 4. Can billionaires and technology save us? For decades now, we've been told by the billionaire class and their backers that they can solve the societal problems we used to solve through collective action. The message we are getting is clear: climate change can be solved as long as a billionaire steps in and offers us a quick fix. A quick look into some of the most well-respected planetary heroes gives us an indication as to whether this is true. Elon Musk is preparing for us to decamp from Earth for freezing oxygen-less Mars, meanwhile sets up a company to bore tunnels through the Earth. Michael Bloomberg gave large donations to green groups whilst setting up a firm specialising in oil and gas assets. Richard Branson failed to ever live up to his promise of giving $3 billion to fight climate change, while simultaneously launching domestic airline Virgin America, Virgin Australia, and British domestic airline Little Red, soaring his greenhouse gas emissions by 40%. Bill Gates professes to care deeply about climate change and invests in nuclear reactors and geoengineering schemes, whilst investing at least $1.2 billion in oil giants like BP and ExxonMobil, and dismissing renewable energy solutions as cute and non-economic. Many people have argued that this apparent philanthropy is simply a way for them to get more money. In most cases, this charitable giving correlates with a rise in value of their assets and a way to avoid the type of regulatory action that would impact their profit margins. Whether or not this is true, what these people have demonstrated is that there isn't going to be a billionaire superhero that is going to come and save the day. When we don't look to billionaires for a solution, we look to technology to save the day. In fact, investing in geoengineering has become the billionaire class's ideal solution to climate change, with proponents like the former CEO of ExxonMobil singing its praises. Why? Because despite the huge risk it involves and the little evidence that proves it will work effectively, geoengineering is cheaper to governments and does not challenge the status quo. It leaves the people who advocate it in dominant positions, and rather than challenging consumerism, industrialism, and capitalism, it actively promotes it. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that technology is useless and shouldn't be used, but the idea that only capitalism can save us from a problem that it has created is a hypothesis that has been tested, and the soaring emissions speak for themselves. Undoubtedly, more billionaires and technological saviors will profess to come to the rescue and save us all, but we don't have the luxury of time to lose pining our hopes on this happening. Part 5. Will our governments save us? The majority of conservatives and Republicans across the world believe that climate change isn't happening, or if it is happening, it's not because of human activity. The most powerful man alive today, Donald Trump, has a consistent history of climate change denial and was elected on a platform of climate denial. Because of this, many people think that the Democrats are the good guys that will save the planet. However, whilst they're undoubtedly better than the Republicans, the fracking boom began under the presidency of Obama. The Democrats overturned a ban on candidates taking contributions from fossil fuel companies and embraces the energy policies that encouraged the extraction boom. Beyond the US, legislation designed to protect the environment hasn't amounted to much. For example, the 2015 Paris Agreement, which committed the international community to restricting global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade, wasn't legally binding, had no legal requirements for the signatories to do anything specific, and no penalties if they didn't do any of those things. So of course, there isn't a single country in the Paris Accord that are on track to implement the policies they agreed upon. And even with such minuscule aspirations, the US, the biggest carbon polluter in history, has pulled out of it. Despite the Kyoto Protocols in 1997, global emissions were nearly 3 times as great per annum in the first 4 years of the 21st century as they were in the 1990s. Meetings in Copenhagen and Cancun showed that there was no political will to respond to the climate and ecological crisis we face. False solutions such as green technology were again promoted. The UNFCCC has adopted an objective to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere to safe levels. Yet, over the past 25 years, greenhouse gas emissions have reached a record high. Despite all the climate summits and agreements over the past few decades, such as the Kyoto Protocol, the Cancun and Paris agreements, as well as hundreds of decisions on so many other climate change issues, greenhouse gas emissions are 60% higher than 1994 levels. In order to stay at a safe level, emissions would have to be reduced by about 90% by 2100, and we are nowhere near to this. When solutions to climate change are promoted, governments tend to promote managerial solutions such as carbon taxing or population control measures or conscious consumerism. In other words, managerial solutions that aren't going to bring about the level of change needed to prevent climate change catastrophe. So clearly, all of this has shown that we can't rely on people in positions of power to solve the problem. And all the evidence suggests that environmentalists, corporations, billionaires, technology, governments aren't going to bring about the level of change needed to avoid catastrophe. Part 6. How can we solve this crisis? We must let go of efforts to resolve environmental injustice within the constraints of capitalism and transcend this economic system. We must work to build a system that uses the resources and wealth of our planet to provide the highest quality of life for the most amount of people as possible. Education. As we have seen, climate catastrophe will undoubtedly lead to a more violent world, and with more and more people tempted to recoil into their national identity and fascism springing up throughout the world. We must become competent in the use of self-defense, first aid, growing food, purifying water, and arm ourselves with the skills necessary to tackle climate change. We must educate as many people as we can about climate change, and that it can't be solved without systemic change. That being said, whilst education is important, history has shown that information alone is never going to be enough. In fact, research has found that the more science and evidence accumulates, the less concerned the public is. I'll link below a video I made that outlines effective communication strategies to get people to care about and take action to address climate change. Organising. Powerful capitalists have more to lose from revolution than climate change, so they will do everything to stop us from organising for change. So we must be organised and powerful enough to challenge their counter-offences and build a movement that is able to transform society. Working alongside other social justice groups. There are thousands of groups who are already at the forefront of the struggle against climate change. Urban and rural workers, indigenous people, and people in the global south are fighting exploitative multinational corporations, and many are adopting elements of socialist and anti-capitalist thinking. More must be done to further these movements and build solidarity between anti-capitalist ecological mobilizations in the north and the south. Organising could also include experimenting with different ways of producing basic needs and caring for people that is more sustainable and guided by values beyond capital accumulation. For example, developing local currencies, eco-housing, community gardens, collective kitchens. As Revolutionary Left Radio states, climate change makes a mockery of purity politics. We can't keep arguing amongst ourselves, hyper-focusing on our sectarian differences whilst the world hurtles towards apocalypse. We can't move forward on a path rooted in blind doctrine and dogmatism. We have to build coalitions between different groups on the left. We need to integrate climate change concerns with other social movements, recognizing that we are all fighting the same struggle. We are encouraged to think of social issues in terms of a single issue approach. If you care about women, you fight for women's rights. If you care about racial issues, you fight for the rights of people of colour. This is especially true for environmental issues, which have been relegated to something that only nature lovers or hippies take part in. But that's what the people in power want. They want us to be separated and oppressed individually, because that way we are less of a threat. We need to begin uniting with other social movements, since social justice is inseparable from the struggle for environmental justice. For example, For those who care about racial and economic injustices, climate change is having immediate and devastating impacts on the world's poorest people, who are disproportionately people of colour, who are the least responsible yet hit the hardest. For those who care about feminism due to factors like less social and physical mobility, greater poverty and social norms, it is women across the globe who are disproportionately impacted by climate change. For those who care about refugee rights, we are projected to have an additional 140 to 200 million climate refugees by 2050. For those that care about animal welfare, climate change is resulting in mass species extinction. If you care deeply about world hunger, we have just 60 years of fertile soil left before we have no soil left to grow food. We cannot have justice for these other social movements without addressing climate change. And I'm not saying let's all focus on climate change and forget about the other issues, but by uniting social movements, we are all more effective at creating change. All those fighting for social justice benefit from movements that challenge the capitalist system because it's the same system we are all oppressed by. Reform and lifestyle. Whilst we should have no illusions that lifestyle actions and green capitalism will be enough to avert catastrophe, it does not mean that we should abandon the fight for concrete and urgent reforms right now. This includes things like elevating the terrible conditions of people whose communities are deemed sacrifice zones by capitalists, getting involved in demonstrations and civil disobedience, fighting for reforms such as moving to full renewable energy, stopping the production of traditional gasoline-powered transportation, creating unionized climate jobs, taxing the rich more, defunding the military, stopping factory farming, stopping fossil fuel infrastructure projects, banning fracking and tar sands extraction, stopping trees from being cut down, and planting them by the thousands. In terms of lifestyle, you can use LED light bulbs, drive a hybrid or electric car, use public transportation, have a vegan diet. Whilst these things alone won't be enough, they are important and worth fighting for. Conclusion. Rather than hearing all of this and feeling hopelessness and despair, we must allow it to push us forward and inspire us to work every day for a world that will not be ravaged by climate change, where we have cooperation over competition, a world that doesn't turn the natural world into commodities to be made into profit, and where the wealth and resources of the world provide the highest quality of life for the most amount of human beings as possible. Global environmental politics is a huge and complex topic, and there's a lot I've had to miss out for the sake of making the video more concise and short. So I've linked a bunch of resources in the description box, and I'd highly recommend checking out Naomi Klein, P.D. Morin's video on the problem with our planet, Mexi's video on climate change and capitalism, the Vegan Vanguard's podcast in general, Mad Blender's video on social ecology. Thank you so much for watching, and as these videos take a long time to make and aren't monetized in any way, I'd really appreciate it if you considered becoming a Patreon or making a one-time donation via PayPal. And I want to say a big thank you to my current Patreons. I really appreciate your support so much.